Close your eyes for just 1 second. Imagine a sound, 80,000 people, all breathing at the same time, all waiting for the same thing. A ball hasn't moved yet. The match hasn't started, but the air inside that stadium is already doing something to your chest, something you can't explain and don't need to. You've never been inside that stadium, but you know exactly what I'm describing. The United States has won Olympic gold in basketball, dominated the NFL, produced the greatest athletes this planet has ever seen, and somehow, for decades, fell behind, not ignored. Behind, there's a difference. Ignoring is a choice. Falling behind happens while you're looking the other way, mocked, called boring, said it would never work here. And now, the biggest sporting event in human history is landing in your backyard, in your city, in your stadium. And most Americans still can't name 5 players. Think about that. Every other country on earth, rich, poor, big, small, grew up with this. It wasn't something they chose. It was just there, in the streets, in the schoolyards, in their fathers' voices on a Sunday afternoon. America chose differently. And for a long time, that felt fine. But 2026 is coming fast. And this, right here, is the story of how a nation of champions became the last country on earth to fall in love with the beautiful game, and why this time there's no looking away. Let's be honest about something. If you grew up in America, soccer probably felt like someone else's thing, not in a hostile way, just distant, like a movie playing in another room that you never quite walked into. You had football, real football, where men collide at full speed and the crowd shakes the concrete beneath your feet. You had basketball, the most athletic sport ever invented, played above the rim, above logic, above gravity itself. You had baseball, which isn't just a sport in America, it's a memory. It's your grandfather's voice drifting through a screen door on a summer evening when you were too young to understand the score, but old enough to feel that something mattered. Why would you need anything else? That's not arrogance. That's just how culture works. You inherit what's around you. You love what you were given. And America was given extraordinary things. But here's what nobody told you. While America was perfecting its own games, the rest of the world was building something else entirely. Something that didn't need billion-dollar stadiums, or franchise fees, or network television deals to survive. Something that needed nothing more than a ball and a patch of flat ground. A kid in Buenos Aires, a kid in Lagos, a kid in Jakarta. Same ball, same dream, no coach, no equipment, no system, just the game. And that simplicity, that absolute, almost brutal simplicity, is exactly what made it spread to every corner of this earth in a way that no American sport ever could. Not because American sports aren't great, they are, but because greatness and universality are two very different things. Greatness needs resources, but universality just needs a ball. That's not a small distinction. That's the entire reason this sport owns the world, and America never felt the earthquake. It's landing now. You can feel it in the crowds at Inter Miami. You can feel it in the youth leagues, become the most participated sport among kids under 12 in the United States. You can feel it in the way a certain player walked into this country and made people stop what they were doing. Not because he was marketed perfectly, because he was just him. And that's the thing about this sport that no American broadcast ever quite explained. It doesn't ask you to understand it immediately. It just plays. And at some point, usually when you're not expecting it, something happens on that field that gets inside you. A run, a pass, a moment of individual genius inside a collective effort. And you think, wait, I've seen effort before. I've seen talent before, but I've never seen it look quite like that. That's the door. Most Americans are standing right in front of it. And here's what nobody talks about. What's waiting on the other side of that door isn't a sport. It's a world that's been having a conversation for 100 years without you. And in 2026, that conversation is coming to your street. The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is, what took so long? But that question has an answer. And the answer is darker and more interesting than you think. There's a match that happened in 1950 that most Americans don't know about, and they probably should. But before the match, there's a man. His name is Joe Gaetjens. He's 26 years old. He came to New York from Haiti to study accounting. He washes dishes at a restaurant in Manhattan to pay his rent. He plays soccer on weekends because that's what he's always done. The way you keep doing the things that feel like home when everything else around you is foreign. Someone notices him playing, and somehow, through a chain of circumstances that would be called implausible in a movie, Joe Gaetjens ends up on the United States national team in Brazil in the biggest international soccer tournament on earth. Nobody gave them a chance. The squad was assembled from postal workers, teachers, amateurs. They trained on inadequate fields with almost no budget. The English team they were about to face had been playing organized soccer for nearly a century. English football was the origin of the sport itself. These were the men who wrote the rules. The English were so confident, they barely bothered preparing. Then the 37th minute happened. A cross came in from the left. Gaetjens threw his body at it, fully horizontal, parallel to the ground, and deflected the ball with his head into the net. United States 1, England 0. That was the final score. The English press assumed it was a typo, literally. Editors in London received the telegram and changed the scoreline before publishing, because the alternative, that America had beaten England at soccer, was simply not something their minds would accept. Back in the United States, almost nobody noticed. The story ran in a few newspapers. Buried, no celebration, no parade, no phone calls to the White House. The players came home to silence so complete, it was almost surreal. Gaetjens went back to washing dishes. That silence tells you everything. It wasn't that Americans couldn't play. Americans could play. The 1950 squad beat England. England, the country that invented the sport. What Americans couldn't do was care, and indifference, and it turns out, is far more dangerous than inability. The same year, on the other side of that tournament, something happened that would haunt an entire nation for 70 years. Brazil lost the final at home in Rio de Janeiro in the Maracanã Stadium, which held that day somewhere between 200 and 210,000 people. the largest crowd ever assembled to watch a sporting event in human history. 200,000 people, one place, all expecting the same thing. Brazil had only needed a draw to win the title. They were the favorites, the hosts. The country had spent years and a fortune building that stadium specifically for this moment. The morning of the match, a Rio newspaper had already printed the headline declaring Brazil champions. Uruguay won, 2-1. What followed was described by journalists as a national funeral. Schools closed. People wept openly in the streets. A goalkeeper named Moacir Barbosa was held personally responsible by an entire country for the defeat and spent the remaining 50 years of his life carrying that weight. Strangers would approach him in supermarkets and tell him he had made their children sad. He was never selected for the national team again. He died in 2000, still defined by 90 seconds on a field half a century earlier. When Barbosa was dying, he said something that has stayed with me. He said, "The maximum sentence in Brazil is 30 years. I have been paying for 50. America looked at all of that, the grief, the obsession, the complete dissolution of rational perspective, and thought, this is madness. Maybe it is, but there's another word for it, meaning. When something can break your heart that completely, it means something that most entertainment never reaches. It lives somewhere deeper than preference, deeper than habit. It touches the place where identity actually lives. America has never had that with this sport, not yet. What happens to a country that size, with that much passion, with that much noise, when it finally does? That answer starts with a man most Americans have never heard of. 37 minutes. Absolute silence. Let me try to explain something. That's almost impossible to explain. What it actually feels like to grow up with this sport, not to watch it, not to follow it casually on a Sunday. To grow up inside it, to have it be the water you swim in before you're old enough to know you're swimming. Imagine you're 7 years old in Sao Paulo. Your father doesn't ask which team you want to support. That question doesn't exist in his vocabulary. His team is your team. His colors are your colors. His grief is your inheritance. And his joy is the first real joy you'll ever feel. That has nothing to do with your own life and everything to do with something larger than it. You don't choose it, it chooses you. And then comes the suffering. Because supporting a team, really supporting one, the way it's done in most of the world, means absorbing loss as a personal experience, not as a fan disappointed by a bad season. As someone whose identity is partially constructed around something that can fail publicly, repeatedly, and without mercy. Manchester United fans in the 1980s know this. For years, long, painful years, Liverpool dominated English football, and United fans didn't just lose matches. They lost arguments. They lost the right to walk into certain rooms with their heads fully up. Losing in sport, when sport is identity, doesn't feel like entertainment going wrong. It feels like something true about you has been publicly disproven. And then Alex Ferguson arrived. What Ferguson built over the next 2 decades wasn't just a successful football club. It was a restoration. That's the word, not a championship. A restoration of something that felt like it had been taken. And every trophy carried that extra weight. The weight of the years before. The weight of what it had cost to get there, America understands that story. It's the same story America tells about itself, which is exactly why, when a certain player arrived in this country recently, something unexpected happened. People who had never watched a single match drove to stadiums to see him play, not because they understood the sport, but because they recognized something in him. That particular kind of hunger, the kind that doesn't come from comfort, the kind that comes from having had nothing and deciding with a clarity that most people never find that that was never going to be the story again. America has always responded to that because America was built by people who had that same look in their eyes. And maybe that's the bridge. Not tactics, not rules, not learning what offside means, which, by the way, is much simpler than people pretend. The bridge is character. The bridge is recognizing something human. In the way this game is played at its highest level, the way one moment of individual will inside a collective effort can shift the entire emotional weight of 90 minutes. But here's what makes this sport different from everything America already loves. In American sports, there is almost always time. Timeouts, possessions remaining. The architecture of American sport is built on the assumption that the game isn't over until the final buzzer, and the final buzzer is always visible. On the scoreboard above you, in this sport, that assumption doesn't exist. No timeouts, no challenges, no commercial breaks between you and the result, just 90 minutes, and whatever happens inside them. That compression is what makes a single goal feel the way it feels, not as a point on a scoreboard, as a rupture, as a before and after, as a line drawn through time that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. America is a country that understands pressure, that understands what it means to need something and have one chance to get it. This sport is built entirely from that feeling. There is a door, and on the other side of it is everything America has been too busy to find until now, until 2026. What does this sport look like on the other side? The answer took America 30 years to build, and nobody planned a single day of it. Something shifted in America, and it didn't happen the way anyone predicted. Nobody planned it. No executive in a boardroom decided it was time. No marketing campaign engineered it. It happened the way most real cultural changes happen. Slowly, quietly, at the edges. Until one day you look up and the center has already moved. And you're not entirely sure when it happened or who moved it. Go back to 1994. Specifically, go back to a parking lot outside the Rose Bowl in Pasadena on a July afternoon so hot the asphalt was soft under your shoes. A man named Tab Ramos, one of the best American players of his generation, was walking toward the stadium before a match and stopped because the crowd outside wasn't what anyone had prepared for. It wasn't a polite American sporting crowd. It wasn't organized tailgating and face paint and the comfortable rituals of a fan base that knows what it's doing. It was something rawer than that. Flags from a dozen countries, singing that had started hours earlier and hadn't stopped. Families who had driven through the night, wearing colors that meant something to them, that they had never been able to express in this country before. Ramos stood there and thought, this already exists here. It already exists. We just never gave it a place to be. The tournament that summer became the most attended in history at the time. Americans filled stadiums in a heat that made the players from temperate European countries genuinely suffer, and they made noise that stunned everyone who had predicted indifference. But then it ended, and America went back to its routines. The domestic league survived its first decade, barely. Teams folded, stadiums sat half empty. The sport retreated to the edges of the American sporting conversation, like a guest who had overstayed the invitation and was now quietly moving toward the door. And yet, something had been planted that summer that nobody could see yet, because the thing that had been planted was a generation. The children who attended those 1994 matches, 7 years old, 8 years old, sitting on their father's shoulders to see over the crowd, grew up, had children of their own, and then those kids became teenagers. Teenagers in 2012 didn't experience sport, television schedules, and network deals. They experienced it through their phones, through highlight packages and full match replays, and the kind of deep, unfiltered access to the best players in the world that previous generations had never had. What they found there wasn't what their parents had described. It wasn't slow. It wasn't confusing. It wasn't foreign. It was the most watchable sport on earth at full quality, full speed, full sound. A Brazilian winger running at a defender with the ball seemingly attached to his foot by something other than skill. A goalkeeper saving a penalty and sprinting the length of the field with his arms spread like he's trying to hold the whole sky. A stadium of 80,000 people making a sound that your phone speaker couldn't contain. And that made you want, immediately and without thinking about it, to be inside that sound. A generation discovered this entirely on their own, without being told to, without a marketing push, without a television deal forcing it into their living rooms. They just found it. And once you find something yourself, really find it in the dark, before anyone tells you it's worth your time, it sticks differently. It becomes yours in a way that inherited things never quite are. Can't be talked out of it, because nobody talked you into it. That generation is in their 20s now. They know the players. They know the clubs. They are the audience that 2026 is walking into, not a country being introduced to something foreign. A country finally being given the stage to celebrate something it has quietly, privately, been building toward for 30 years, and the rest of the world hasn't realized it yet. They still pack their jokes about soccer. They still prepare their condescending explanations. They still assume they're arriving somewhere that needs to be converted. It was always already here. 2026 is not the beginning of something. It's the surface, finally becoming visible. But here's what the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. They're not arriving at a country that's learning. They're arriving at a country that's been ready for years and never said a word. Let me tell you about a woman named Gloria. She's 63 years old. She came to Los Angeles from El Salvador in 1987 with 2 suitcases and her youngest son, who was 4 at the time. She found work, found an apartment in a neighborhood where Spanish was the first language, and English came second. Built a life from the kind of patience that only people who have left everything behind truly understand. Every 4 years, without fail, Gloria would find the matches on whatever channel carried them, pull the old flag from the back of the closet, and sit in front of the television with her son and feel for 90 minutes at a time like the distance between her living room in Los Angeles and the country she left behind had collapsed completely. Her son is 37 now. He has 2 kids of his own, and in the summer of 2026, El Salvador plays their first match of the tournament, 20 minutes from Gloria's apartment in her city. Think about what that means, not as a sports story, as a human story. As the story of what happens when something that has always lived in the private interior of a life, in a flag in the back of a closet, in a television screen at odd hours, in a conversation held in a language the neighbors don't speak, suddenly becomes public, visible, celebrated in the streets of the city you chose, when you left everything else behind. That story is going to happen millions of times in the summer of 2026. Because America is not one thing. America contains Brazil. It contains Mexico. And the Mexico match, whenever it comes, in whatever city it lands, is going to produce an atmosphere that stops people on the street outside the stadium. America contains Portugal, Nigeria, South Korea, El Salvador, Poland, Japan, Morocco, Argentina. It contains every nation that plays this sport in the form of communities that have kept their connection to it alive through decades of living in a country that didn't always acknowledge it existed. 16 cities will host matches: New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, San Francisco, Miami, Boston, Seattle, Atlanta, Kansas City, Houston, Philadelphia, spread across the country like a constellation of moments waiting to happen simultaneously, in places that have never experienced anything quite like this. Each of those cities contains a Gloria, hundreds of thousands of Glorias, people for whom this tournament isn't entertainment arriving from outside. It's recognition arriving at last. And that energy, that specific, concentrated, deeply personal energy, is going to mix with something else entirely. With the Americans who grew up knowing nothing about this sport and are about to experience it live for the first time, who will walk into a stadium in Dallas or Seattle not entirely sure what they're watching and come out 2 hours later unable to explain what happened to them. Because that's what a live match does to a first-timer. It doesn't educate you. It doesn't explain itself. It just creates a pressure inside the stadium, built from noise and movement, and the particular collective holding of breath that happens in the seconds before something decisive occurs, that reorganizes something in your chest without asking permission. You come out different. The United States team in 2026 carries that tension completely. They have players now, real players, who grew up in this new America, who developed in European academies and have spent years competing at the highest level, capable of things that would have been unimaginable to the people who watched 1994 and went home satisfied just to have been present. This team wants more than presence, and the country is going to feel that want on a Tuesday night in a stadium somewhere in this country when the anthem plays and the players stand in that line and the crowd goes quiet for just 1 second before it erupts. That second, that single second of absolute silence, Gloria will be there. Her son will be there. His kids, who were born in this country and speak English without an accent and have never seen the flag from the back of the closet without understanding exactly what it means. They'll be there too. And in that second, Before the noise returns, every version of America that this sport has been quietly holding together will exist in the same place, at the same time, and something will happen that no broadcaster will quite find the words for. But everyone in that stadium will carry it home and never fully put it down. And here's the thing, nobody tells you about moments like that. They don't just change how you see a sport, they change how you see the country you're standing in. If you're still here, and I know you are, it's because something in this conversation landed somewhere real. That feeling right now where you're not sure if you want to finish the video or call someone and talk about it, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe. We're going to be here every week between now and 2026 and beyond, going deep on the stories that the highlight packages skip and the mainstream coverage never finds time to tell properly. The players who changed the sport without ever being famous enough to trend on social media. The matches that rewrote history in front of crowds that had no idea they were watching history being rewritten. The cities and the communities and the people like Gloria, who have been carrying this thing quietly for decades and deserve to have their story told out loud. If that's a conversation you want to keep having, this is where it lives. And leave a comment before you go. Tell me something honest. Tell me where you started this video. Whether you came in already knowing the sport deeply, or whether you came in standing at that door I mentioned, curious, a little skeptical, not entirely sure what was on the other side. I want to know where you are right now, because where you are right now is exactly where this gets interesting. And that brings me to the thing I've been circling this entire time. The question underneath everything else. Why does it actually matter? Not why does the tournament matter logistically? Not why does the sport matter to the people who already love it? But why does it matter right now in this specific moment in history that America finally arrives at this? Here's what I keep coming back to. There is a version of the world right now that is more fragmented than it has been in a long time, more divided along lines that feel increasingly permanent, more convinced that the distance between people who see things differently is a distance that cannot be crossed. And then every 4 years, something happens that quietly, without making any argument, without demanding anything of anyone, puts 8 billion people in the same conversation, not agreeing, not pretending the differences don't exist, just watching the same thing, caring about the same 90 minutes, held inside the same tension at the same moment, across every time zone on Earth. That's not nothing. That's actually one of the rarest things left. And America, the country that has spent a century on the outside of that conversation, is about to become its host, not a spectator, not a late arrival apologizing for the delay. The host, which means something specific and serious and worth thinking about. Because a host doesn't just provide the venue, a host sets the tone. A host decides what kind of welcome looks like. And the welcome that America extends to those 8 billion people in the summer of 2026, the energy in those stadiums, the warmth in those cities, the genuine curiosity or lack of it that greets the world when it arrives. That welcome is going to say something about this country that no speech or policy or headline ever quite manages to say. It's going to say it in the oldest language there is, in a crowd, in a roar, in the way strangers stand next to each other for 90 minutes and forget, briefly but completely, that they arrived as strangers. Joe Gaetjens came home to silence. No crowd at the airport, no phone calls, no front pages. The man who headed the ball that beat England, the greatest upset in the history of the sport at that point, came back to New York and went back to washing dishes. And nobody stopped him on the street to say what he'd done. He spent the rest of his life moving between countries. Eventually returned to Haiti, disappeared in 1964, taken by the Tonton Macoutes, the secret police of the Duvalier regime, and was never seen again. His family never received an official explanation. His body was never found. A man who made history that nobody witnessed, carried by a country that never knew his name. I've been thinking about Joe Gaetjens this entire time, about what it means that his moment, that specific, extraordinary, unrepeatable moment in the 37th minute of a match in 1950, happened in complete isolation from the country he represented. That the thing he did was real and significant and world-stopping everywhere, except the one place it should have mattered most. That gap between what happened and what was felt, between the significance of a moment and the capacity of a place to receive it. That gap is what 2026 is closing, not with a ceremony or a declaration, just with time, just with the slow, unglamorous, completely human process of a culture deciding, not all at once, not consciously, but collectively and irreversibly, that something matters. America decided. It decided in youth leagues and phone screens and living rooms where immigrants watched matches at odd hours, with the volume low so the neighbors wouldn't hear. It decided in parking lots outside the Rose Bowl in 1994, where Tab Ramos stopped walking because the crowd looked different from anything he'd prepared for. It decided in the quiet accumulation of 30 years of private passion that never needed a press release because it wasn't performing for anyone. It just was. And now the world is coming here. Coming to the cities where Gloria kept her flag in the back of the closet. Coming to the stadiums where a generation that discovered this sport alone on their phones will finally experience it the way it was meant to be experienced. Inside the sound, inside the crowd, inside the specific electricity of 70,000 people breathing together around something that matters. Coming to a country that has spent a century looking at this sport through a window and is finally, in the summer of 2026, going to open the door. There's something I want to leave you with, not a conclusion, not a lesson, just an image. Somewhere in America right now, in a suburb, a city apartment, in a house near a field, there is a kid who is 7 or 8 years old, who has been kicking a ball against a wall since before they could fully explain why, who watches matches on a tablet at an hour when they're supposed to be asleep, who has a favorite player whose name their parents can't pronounce, and whose jersey they wear until it falls apart. That kid has no idea what's coming. They don't know that in a few years, the whole world is going to arrive in their country to play the sport they love, in the cities they know. They don't know that the thing they do alone against a wall is the same thing being done by children on every continent, in every language, under every kind of sky. They just know it feels like something. They just know that when the ball does what they want it to do, when it goes exactly where they asked it to go, something happens in their chest that they don't have words for yet. They'll find the words. 2026 will give them the words. And when that kid is grown, They're sitting somewhere years from now trying to explain to someone younger why this sport means what it means to them. They'll go back to that summer, to a stadium, to a sound, to a second of silence before the crowd became something larger than itself, and they'll say, "That's when I understood. That's when it stopped being something I watched and became something I carried." Joe Gaetjens headed a ball into a net in 1950 and came home to nothing. 76 years later, the world is coming to him. Not because America finally decided to care, but because the gap has a limit. And 2026 is it.